As we start this series this morning, let me ask you this question. How would you define hope? We had a little discussion about that in our small group this past week. How did you define hope? And as we went around the group and talked about that a little bit, we became aware of the fact that a lot of people define hope as kind of like wishing, kind of like making a wish, like the Wish Foundation that's sponsoring the Jolly Holiday Lights out at Adventureland. If you've had a chance to go there, or you will be going there. You make this wish and you hope things come true, but you never know if they will or not, and you're dependent on someone else. So what does it mean? What does it mean to have hope in the biblical sense in this time of Advent? And what does it mean if God is with us? How does God with us influence or bring that kind of hope into our lives? I want us to explore that. And perhaps the best way to begin to think about that is through a true story that was featured on CBS some time ago, about a true story of two fishermen out in the Atlantic by the name of Anthony Sosinski and John Aldridge. They set out to fish from Montauk, Long Island, and as they headed out about 40 miles into the sea, they were cruising along just doing quite well, when Anthony decided to take a nap in preparation for the big catch that they were going to get in just a little while. And so he went down into the cabin of the boat and went to take a nap. And John was out getting the rigging ready to get ready for the big catch that they were going to take. And he was at the back of the boat and using all of his strength to pull on a handle that was not coming loose, when all of a sudden the handle broke and he went flying off the back of the boat. He began to scream and holler, but he knew that Anthony would never hear his cries, and unfortunately the boat was on autopilot, so it just kept cruising. And as John began to float in the waters, he came up and tried to get his bearings and yelled and realized that that was useless. The last he saw was the boat went over the crest of the wave and it was gone, out of sight. And he was there treading water thinking there is no hope. You talk about a hopeless situation. That might be it, or was it? Because as John was floating there treading water a little bit, he realized that his boots were quite buoyant in the water. So he finally struggled and got one of his boots off and emptied it out, and then he plunged it back into the water, and sure enough it floated. And so he found a way to extend those to his arms, and they became flotation devices that kept his head above the water, and he floated there. Well, there was hardly a chance in the world that the Coast Guard or anybody would ever find him in any way, shape, or form, but he floated there, and 4 hours later, Anthony woke up in the boat and went out on the deck to find John and discovered that he was gone, and he immediately called the Coast Guard, and they said, well, the chances of finding him in this huge body of water is almost slim to none. But they began to search. John made it through the night, floating there, thinking about his family, thinking about all the things that were going on. Nobody would even know that he was missing at all, and he wouldn't know anything about that. And so he just kind of let those things slip in and out of his thinking, and he didn't have much hope at all. Well, he made it alive till the next morning, made it through the night. And in less than an hour after he had made it through the night, some 12 hours later, a helicopter actually spotted him. A Coast Guard helicopter spotted him, and they rescued him. They pulled him to safety, and when they got to the safety in the helicopter, one of the Coast Guard said to him, you know, we've been looking for you for 9 hours. And John said, well, I've been looking for you for 12 hours. Miraculously, John survived that ordeal in his life. What an amazing story. But as I thought about that story, I thought, how many of us would have survived bobbing for 12 hours in the Atlantic Ocean? And especially at one point when no one was around except 2 swimming sharks in the water that fortunately didn't seem to care that he was there. How many of us would have survived that, and would we have given up hope early? I tell you, when I think about that, I don't know what I would do in that type of situation. Many of us might give up hope of even a chance, a sliver of a chance to survive. But have you noticed something in life? Have you noticed that sometimes it's in the sliver chances of survival that hope thrives best? Think about that. The hopeless situation, hope is a whisper that maybe the boots will float. Hope is the first candle that you light, and it sends out a flame after the lights and the power have all gone out in the middle of the night in a storm. Hope is the percentage that you have in beating the cancer that you've been diagnosed with. Hope is the faint line on a stick when you've been trying to get pregnant for months and months and months, hoping that you could have a child. It's the first ray of sunshine. It's the first soldier to land on a beach. It's a flicker. Maybe, just maybe. It's that kind of hope that fuels our faith. It's that kind of hope that fuels our future. It's that kind of hope that we celebrate on this first Sunday of Advent. And Advent actually becomes the season of hope. In fact, one has said that Advent is not just an extension of Christmas. It's not an extension. It's not something to spread out the Christmas celebration. Advent is the very center of Christmas that brings the past, the present, and the future together so that we can see it for what it is. It offers the opportunity to share in the ancient longing for the coming Messiah. And so during Advent, we come to wait. It's an active, assured, and hopeful waiting. We are the people of God in the middle of 2 comings. One that was promised and fulfilled that we call Christmas, and the second Advent that is yet to come when Jesus will come back to earth and set up His kingdom. And we stand in between those, sandwiched in between those, with hope. That's how we live there. But would you agree with me this morning that waiting for anything, and especially waiting for a Messiah, can be hard? Hard. We're impatient people, some of us more than others. We just have a hard time waiting, and especially when waiting becomes painful, when waiting becomes extended beyond what we thought or expectations of what we hoped would happen, it becomes painful. And I don't know, what do you do when waiting becomes painful and hope becomes delayed and prolonged and extended? What do you do? I would probably say that most of us find some kind of way to dull the pain, to do something to try to bring excitement into the process of the long, dreary waiting period. And many times we try to do it by just getting busy. And especially in the Christmas Advent season, we just get busy with all kinds of things in our life. We cover our pain with this frenzied busyness. And then some of us try to take shortcuts, and we try to move into other areas. And sometimes we just end up lost in some kind of a cul-de-sac of fantasy. We get lost in the Hallmark movies. And it dulls the pain for a while. But then we have to come back to the reality of the life that we face. I don't know about you, but in my family, I'm kind of famous when we take a trip. I'm kind of famous for taking the scenic route. I don't want to go to the same old place, the same old way. It gets boring. You want to see some things. And the family, if you would talk to any one of my kids who are grown now, and if you talk to my wife, they would tell you that I get them lost on those excursions. But the fact is, I've never felt lost. I just hadn't found the way out yet. But I kind of understand that. I know what it's like to get lost in a cul-de-sac for a little while. But then we discover that the busyness and the shortcuts detour us from the opportunity that Advent calls us to set our hearts apart and begin to look at this story of redeeming love. God coming in redeeming love to a fallen, broken world of humanity. And it invites us into a season of not fantasy, not a season of pretending, not a season of binge watching the Christmas movies. It calls us into digging deeper into God's Word to understand what this mystery really is of the God who becomes flesh, incarnate, in the person, a human being, in the brokenness of our world, and begin to dig into what it means for that person, Emmanuel, Jesus, who means God with us. What has He come to do? I don't know where you are in your spiritual journey this morning, but I'd like to invite you into this season. You say, but Pastor, this year is different. It's not a real fun season for me. There's a lot of things that have happened. Maybe you'd say, I've lost a parent this year. I've lost a loved one. There's been one too many funerals. There's been things that have happened in our lives, and there's been reverses in the employment, and we're not sure what the future holds. And this Advent and Christmas season is not a real joyful time for us this year. It's not very exciting. Could I still invite you into this Advent season where there's plenty of room for your struggles and there's plenty of room for your questions and your doubts? Bring those into the waiting process of Advent as we prepare our hearts for Christ's coming the second time. Could I invite you into a celebration of Advent in which we would like for it to be the message of a God who comes to be with us to fix things? That's what I want a God to do. I want Him to come and fix some things in my life. And I want Him to do it by next Tuesday. I want Him to fix it. Could I invite you into an Advent experience in which God doesn't yet come to just fix everything like a broken computer or to fix things like broken families, but to realize that He's in the process of restoring all of those things to us and restoring what is broken, but it is not altogether visible yet. Could you experience the God who first comes into your darkness and your pain and your chaos and walks with you in that with the hope that there is a bright and perfect day that is yet to come? You say, well, how do you do that? Well, you enter in with the people of God who've been doing this all through history. The biblical history is because God came. Have you ever thought about it? Was there hope at the beginning of creation? We had a little discussion about that in our small group this past week. Did hope exist when God had created everything that was perfect? Everything. Perfect fellowship with Him, perfect creation, perfect relationship with each other. Nobody was mad at each other. Nobody was divided. Nobody was upset about anything. There was just this harmony and this relationship, and everything was going great in the garden. Was there any such thing as hope? God walked freely with Adam and Eve and enjoyed the wholeness. I'll leave that to you as to whether you think hope had existed, but we do know you know the story. Adam and Eve chose sin, separation, divided God and human beings from each other, and yet hope was born in that. Right at the moment they fell, hope was born. You say, how can that happen? Because God immediately, and the Bible says that before the foundation of the world, before He ever decided to create anything, He had planned to begin the restoration should human beings fall. And he begins a restoration and healing, and that becomes the overall story of the entire scriptures that we read. And in fact, we begin to see it at the beginning with Abraham. God calls this pagan man to himself, into a relationship with him, and ask him by faith to begin to follow. And God makes him a promise. He says, all the peoples, Abraham, on earth are going to be blessed through you. And later on with Jacob, Jacob wrestles with God in the midst of the struggles that he had with his family and with his brother Esau. And God comes and visits him in a special moment and says, I'm not going to leave you, Jacob, until I have done what I've promised to do to you. So God gave the promises. But then there comes this long era of waiting. Think about it. Years pass. Centuries pass. Generations pass. And these ancient Israelite people from the times of Abraham on, we can echo with them. There's this phrase that keeps showing up in the scriptures in the Old Testament. How long, O God? How long? You ever ask God that? Maybe you asked God that this week. How long do I have to go through this? How long do I have to put up with this? When does this end? That was the cry of the ancient people. And so from the times of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, Elijah, and Elisha, and Isaiah, and Jeremiah, and all the other prophets, we have this repeating history that the people of God become all enamored with the loyalty to the God who created them, and then they get distracted. And they forget about God. And they begin to neglect God, and they get lost. And there's prosperity, and then there's recession, and there's feast, and then there's literal famine, there's pleasure, and there's pain. And the Hebrew people, I tell you, I don't think they're much different than us. When things are really good, we tend to forget God. But when things get really, really bad, then we call the prayer chain, and we want everybody to pray, and we're calling on God again. And yet in the middle of all of that in history, there's this deep inner longing for the coming Messiah who would make everything right. That was their deepest hope. And there's this guy by the name of Isaiah. He's called a major prophet in biblical literature. He's called a major prophet because he talked a lot and he wrote a lot. He preached a lot. He was a very public and prominent figure in Israel. He was rather famous in his day, and everybody liked him. In fact, they liked to attend his church because most of the time his messages were very positive and upbeat. But some of them got a little bent out of shape once in a while when he especially started telling kings and the general publics things they didn't want to hear, like, God doesn't like the way you're cheating the poor. Or when he began to talk a little bit about the enemy empire that was going to invade them and destroy their country, then people didn't like that so much. But Isaiah's main theme in his preaching and writing keeps coming to the forefront. It's the theme of Advent. It's the theme of longing and hope and expecting and hoping for God. You might say that Isaiah is the poster prophet for Advent. If you think about it, everybody recognizes the words out of Isaiah. Whether you recognize that they actually come from Isaiah, I don't know. But Isaiah's prophecies have made it into the Christmas music, especially of George Friedrich Handel's Messiah, that grand stirring oratorio from 1741. It's lasted for centuries. It's part of the Christmas tradition. Why? Because its beauty and its complexity and its truth. It's a moving soundtrack that just builds hope. There's something everybody knows happens when you think about going to hear the Handel's Messiah, and you wait for that moment where everybody can stand and sing, Hallelujah, Hallelujah. That comes straight out of Isaiah. and his prophecies. And no matter what your musical styles are, there's something about that tradition. Isaiah lived 700 years before Jesus, but he gives us some words that ring the hope coming from the Messiah. I want you to see these words this morning. They're found in Isaiah in chapter 7 and through 9. We're just going to pull a couple of these out. Therefore, the Lord himself, Isaiah wrote, will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and you'll call him Emmanuel. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who are in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. And the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. A little later, in the same chapter, Isaiah writes the words that we're familiar with. For unto us a child is born. We sung it this morning. Unto us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. He will reign on his David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness for that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish that. Can you imagine what that was like to hear that in the ancient world before Facebook and emails and Instagram and Twitter and all the rest? You didn't get that kind of communication, but suddenly these ancient people heard this message like this. Can you imagine the hope that would begin to spring in their hearts and lives? I've asked myself the question, do you think Isaiah knew what he was writing and what he was speaking? Do you think he understood all that was involved in that? I think at some level there is the fact that he did. And in fact, in chapter 7, he's talking to a king by the name of Ahaz who's got two bully kings that are ganging up and coming to attack his kingdom. And the Bible says that he's shaking like leaves on a tree in the wind. And Isaiah comes with this message to him about these words of a coming Messiah and in the future and the hope that comes with that. And whether Isaiah understood, I don't know if he understood how far out it would go. Or maybe he did, but he thought it would happen in his lifetime. Messiah was coming in his lifetime. He thought, wow, this is cool. I get to be a part of this. And then he ends up having to wait. Well, the hope of Isaiah was not disappointed or wasted, but it took a little longer than maybe he had expected. For see, when we come to the Gospel of Luke in the New Testament, we find a man named Zechariah, chapter 1, who would have been well acquainted with the words we just read from the book of Isaiah. And he's been waiting around for a long, long time. And the Bible says that he's a righteous and blameless man, that he's a good Jewish follower of God and a spiritual leader to his people. And he's dutifully been waiting. Now I want you to catch how long he's been waiting. The people of God, represented by Zechariah, have been waiting for 14 lifetimes. 14 generations. If you count a generation as 50 years, which was about the average age of that of the ancient people, Zechariah was probably around his 50s at the time that this experience that we have in Luke's Gospel, chapter 1. So he's been waiting 14 lifetimes for the coming Messiah. And in the middle of that 14 lifetimes, there's been 400 years. How old is America? About 242 years, something like that now. Think about it. Double that. 400 years in which there was no new, fresh message from God, from any prophets, from anybody. They had just been going through the religious duty year after year, generation after generation, and God had not spoken through his prophets for 400 years between Malachi and the book of Matthew in the Gospels that we have it there. To give you a comparison, Johannes Kepler, the famous scientist, was discovering planetary laws. If we talked about America, he would have been still finding the planetary laws. North America was still being explored by Europeans, and Jamestown had just been settled, and Henry Hudson had just found the Hudson Bay. And we doubled that. And this is how long Zechariah has been waiting. Long, long time. And then just out of the blue, on an ordinary day, well, not exactly an ordinary day for Zechariah, because he had just won the lottery. Well, not the lottery you think. He had just won the lottery that was given every year for the priests to decide which of the many priests would be the one chosen to go into the Holy of Holies in the temple and to make atonement, make sacrifice for the sins of the people. It happened once a year, and only one priest was chosen, and most priests would never be chosen in their whole lifetime. And so you got your name in the lottery every year, and Zechariah, now an old man at 50-some years of age for his lifespan, he is chosen to go into the Holy of Holies. And so in that sense, it wasn't an ordinary day, but it was the ordinary routine of atonement. And while he's in that space, relishing every holy moment of winning the lottery of the priesthood, God drops in with a mega dose of hope that starts out with terrifying fear. And we pick up the words in Luke's story in verse 11 of chapter 1. An angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing to the right of the incense altar, and Zechariah was shaken and overwhelmed with fear when he saw him. Have you ever noticed in the Bible that when God shows up, it's usually a fearful experience at first? The angel said, "Don't be afraid, Zechariah. God has heard your prayer. Your wife Elizabeth will give you a son, and you are to name him John, and you will have great joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great in the eyes of the Lord. Because of the responsibilities and the duties he'll have, he won't drink wine or any other alcoholic drinks. Instead, he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before his birth. And he will turn many Israelites to the Lord their God, and he'll be a man with the spirit and the power of Elijah. He'll prepare the people for the coming of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and he will cause those who are rebellious to accept the wisdom of the godly." Shock. Absolute, total shock. And yet Zechariah knew exactly what the meaning of those words were, because he knew the prophecies. He had had to memorize them as a young boy, and he knew those words inside out and backwards from Isaiah. The promise of the coming Messiah. And here he is being told that his Elizabeth, his wife, who is old, is going to have a baby. She's way past childbearing. And no doubt, they've tried to have children their whole life. In fact, I can imagine on the street corners and in the shops, whenever Zechariah and Elizabeth's name came up, you could almost hear the conversation said, "Yeah, Zechariah and Elizabeth, yeah, great folks. But they've never been able to have a kid. It's a real shame." Yeah, it is. It's too bad. I don't understand. They've never been able to have a child. And so Zechariah's double shock. He's freaked out by this news. His old wife is going to have a child. He stammers and stutters, and you can almost, you say, "Well, I would have done a little better." I don't know that I would have. He stammers and stutters and says back to the angel who comes from God, Gabriel, and says, "Are you kidding? My wife is old. This cannot be. This cannot be happening." Verse 19, the angel said, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God. It was he who sent me to bring you this good news. But now, since you didn't believe what I said, you're going to be silent and unable to speak." Has God ever had to shut you up? Sometimes I wish he'd shut down Facebook. Has God ever had to shut you up? Why did he do that? Why did he shut him up? Because he didn't want him spewing his fake news and bad attitude all over society. And that's exactly what Zechariah would have done. And God said, I'm going to keep you quiet because you're poison. But I'm going to fulfill my promise through you with your mouth shut. Look what he says. For my words will certainly be fulfilled at the proper time. That phrase, the very presence of God. Would you just say that with me out loud? The very presence of God. One more time. The very presence of God. You know what that word presence means? Literally in the Greek, it means someone who comes and reveals themselves to someone else. It is the revelation of promise. The old prophecies are about to be fulfilled. God's about to stir something up and change eternity. God's about to do something that we're waiting on for a long time. There's about to be a fulfillment of hope at the deepest levels, and hope will live again. So what about you? Now maybe this story's so old and we know it so well that you checked out about 10 minutes ago. I understand. I do that sometimes too. But this is time to wake up, maybe sign off of Facebook and Craigslist and listen up. Because God has a message for you this morning. What about your family? What about us? Maybe some of you are thinking, that's really cool about all those people thousands of years ago. That's really cool what happened to them and all the neat stuff and how it finally came to pass for guys like Zechariah and Elizabeth and Mary and Joseph. But they weren't fighting cancer. Their spouse hadn't been killed in a war halfway around the world. Their kids hadn't been diagnosed with autism and all of the medical trips and everything else that has to happen. They've not been in my shoes. They haven't lost their job. They didn't get some kind of a warning about the fact that their job might not be there. And they weren't struggling with paying their bills. And they weren't struggling with debt that's stacking up and kids that are expecting Christmas present and the mortgage isn't paid. Not to mention, we're not even sure where the meals are going to come from in the next couple of weeks. And you find yourself in the problems and struggles and you go, that's really great about all that hope stuff and those ancient people, but what does it have to do with me? Can I encourage you this morning not to abandon hope, that in the midst of your deepest pain, there is this God who has come and who is yet coming and who will come. How can we know that? How can you take the little spark of hope that you want to hope, but you're on the verge of giving up? How do you fan that spark of hope this morning in your life? How do you fan it alive? No matter what kind of circumstances you're facing. Could I just leave you with two thoughts? And they're so simple. You know them, but you need to hear them. Or at least if you don't, I do. I need to hear this morning. Would you let me talk to myself if you don't need this? How do we fan this spark of hope? I put it in your notes. This hope is based not on wishful thinking, but on the character of God. Look at verse 19 again. I'm Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God. It is He who sent me to bring you this good news. I've come to be a presence who reveals who I really am. God says, I've come so that you could get a picture of me, so you could get an Instagram of what I'm about, what I look like. And I've sent you Jesus, and this is the hope that we have. So that's just the problem, Pastor. The problem I have with Christianity is you guys talk about this God that nobody's ever seen. Oh, Jesus might have lived in history, but how do we know that he's more than just a prophet? Maybe he's just a prophet or a good teacher at best. How do we swallow this claim that he's the Messiah, the very Son of God who has come in the flesh? How do I take that on? How do I experience that? Well, I don't know how you do all of that. That's a discussion that we can have. But it's a question we all have, isn't it? It's a question that came out of the mouth of a 9-year-old boy this week. He was riding along with me, and we're talking about some of these things and Christmas and what Christmas means. And he says to me, how do you know that this God is really exists? Sometimes I have doubts that this God, that 9-year-old boy, I have doubts about whether God exists at all. He said, I never can see him and he never talks to me, and I don't know whether it's just good luck that I'm having or whether he ever answers my prayers. And he said, I don't know if I can believe in this God that I can't see. And in the spur of the moment, the Spirit spoke to me. And I called him by name. And I said, you know why you can't see God? No. I said, because right now in your life, I am God to you. I'm not perfect, I'm a human being, but I have been sent into your life to be God to you until you grow up, and one of these days, you're going to become accountable to God alone. Beyond your mom, beyond your grandma, beyond your papa, you're going to become accountable to God. But until then, I'm in your life as the presence of God, as imperfect as it may be, I'm in your life. And he kind of looked at me shocked. And I said, we're here to take care and to see to it as best we can in our broken humanness that you experience the God who loves you and has a plan for your life. And we're here to give you every request and say yes as many times as we possibly can so that you can grow with an understanding that in a broken world that you've experienced, there is a God who loves you and who said yes to you and who's going to make it all right and who knows how to take your brokenness and make it right. And I'm in your life to make that happen. Is that the kind of God you're looking for? You say, but I'm 30. Yeah, I know. And you feel like you're about 8, don't you? Some days. You feel like a little kid who's been abandoned. And you wonder if any of it's worth the living. Could I say to you this morning that God has put the church in your life. God has put his family in your life. In fact, the Bible says that he gave to those who were orphans, he gave them a family. Who's the family? It's the people of God. It's the church. That's why we gather every Sunday. That's why it's important when we gather, because as we come together, we need to keep reminding ourselves we are not alone. There is God with us. And what's the evidence of that? He has put Christ in our lives. Well, where's Christ? Well, he has given us his body, his very existence, his body in the flesh. The church, you and I, become Jesus to each other. That's Emmanuel, God with us. And it's based on his character. The second thing I notice here is that this hope is not only based on his character, but part of his character specifically is that this hope is based on God's faithfulness. Look at verse 25. We didn't read it earlier, but here's Here's what Elizabeth said. How kind the Lord is. He has taken away my disgrace of having no children. The word kind in this verse means to fulfill a promise. God is faithful to His promise. How does that work when you're going through a difficult period in your life? There was a contemporary guy to Isaiah. His name was Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah was quite a contrast to Isaiah. In fact, Isaiah's message was mostly about hope and feeling good in the future and how things are going to be great. Comfort me, you people. You're going to get a child. Wonderful things are going to happen. It's going to hallelujah. And the desert is going to blossom like a rose. And Isaiah goes on and on. Everybody loved to go to his church. Man, they flocked to his church. But Jeremiah had a different experience. Jeremiah had a call and a message, but he lived in the latter years where the northern kingdom got taken over by the Assyrian Empire, and God was sending messages through him that the Assyrian Empire was going to become the Babylon Empire that would take over the southern kingdom of Judah, where Jeremiah lived and preached. And eventually, just as God warned through Jeremiah, the empire of the Babylon Empire captured Judah. You know, the Daniel and the lion's den and the fiery furnace and all that stuff. Well, that was in the time that Jeremiah lived. And the thing about Jeremiah that's interesting is that nobody was loyal to him. Nobody wanted to attend his church much. He had a pretty small crowd. Nobody wanted to be around him because he was always the doom and gloom preacher. In fact, historians have called Jeremiah the weeping prophet because he cried a lot. He cried a lot over the rebellion and stubbornness of God's people who would not listen to the messages. And he was either always hated by the church or always hated by the government. In fact, they took turns. The government would hate him a while and put him in a prison and in a dungeon, and then the church would get him out. And then the church would hate him because they didn't like his message, so they would get the government to put him back in prison, and then the government would say to the church, that's not fair, and they'd spring him. And his whole life, you read the book of Jeremiah, his whole life is a story of in and out of dungeons and prisons between the government and the church, and they can't figure out what to do with this guy. And in fact, in the end result, the Bible doesn't tell us this, but tradition tells us that they actually finally took Jeremiah and sawed him right in two, in half. That's how he died. You think that Jeremiah struggled with doubts about the faithfulness of God? And things never changed. In fact, every bad thing he ever prophesied, it happened. And so Jeremiah wrote a book that probably you aren't going to use in your Advent story with your children. He wrote a book called the Book of Lamentations. Lament. I read an article this week about how we need to preach lament in Advent. How does that fit? How does it fit with hope? Well, in the Book of Lamentations, Jeremiah's lived his whole life. No loyalty, struggled all the time, everybody taking turns hating him. And then the final comes and the captivity comes and he got to stay in the land, everybody else got taken off. He ended up getting a pretty good treatment from the Babylonian king because he'd become so famous for being such a portrayer, a news reporter for the Babylonian government. They thought he was kind of a hero. They gave him a pretty nice place to live for a while. But in the midst of all this, Jeremiah wrote, "Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope." How in the world do you do that, Jeremiah? I mean, look at your life, man. It's just not been any fun at all. Well, Because Jeremiah said, of the Lord's great love, He hasn't wiped us out. He hasn't consumed us, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. And then you know this phrase. This is where it comes from. Did you know that the great hymn, Great is Your Faithfulness, comes right out of crying a lot and lament? From a poor weeping prophet who never had a good night's rest, hardly ever, and spent most of his life in a dungeon and a prison. And he writes, great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, here's his self-talk, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for Him. The Lord is good. How do you say that, Jeremiah? The Lord is good to those whose hope is in Him, to the one who seeks Him. It's good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Did you catch those phrases? I call to mind, therefore I have... What did He call to mind? I'll tell you what He called to mind. All the stories from Abraham forward in which God had been faithful. The bottom of the pit, he still could see God is faithful. And when we understand that, we know that hope sparks like a fire, it flows like a river, it begins like a seed and begins to grow, and God continues to be faithful, and we focus on that with gratitude so that even psalmists could say, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you're there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me. But even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. Can you feel the hope in those words? You're not alone. Dr. James Dobson tells the story of a lady by the name of Stella Thornhope. It's an interesting name. She was struggling with her first Christmas alone after her husband had died, and it was several days before Christmas, and she was snowed in by a brutal weather system, and she felt terribly alone, so much she decided she was not going to decorate her Christmas tree. But late one afternoon, a few days before Christmas, the doorbell rang, and there was a delivery boy. And he walked in with a big old package in a box with some holes in the top. And he said, I want you to sign. Are you Miss Stanthorpe? Yep, I need you to sign right here. And she said, well, what is it? And he wouldn't answer the question at first. The young man just laughed, and then he kind of took his little knife out, and he very carefully slit the top open, and he lifted the flap, and inside was a little puppy. A golden Labrador retriever puppy. The delivery boy picked up the squirming little pup and explained, this is for you, ma'am. It's for you. He's 6 weeks old. He's been completely housebroken, and the young puppy began to wiggle in happiness, and he wanted to be released from his captivity. And Miss Thornhope was now baffled. She said, who sent this? And he said, well, it came as a present for you. And he handed her an envelope. And he said, it's all explained right here in this little envelope. You look at the envelope and you read that yourself. He told her the dog had been bought last July while its mother was still pregnant. And it was meant to be a Christmas gift to you. And then the young man handed her a book, How to Raise Your Golden Retriever, a Labrador Pup. And in desperation, Stella said again, who sent me this puppy? I want to know who sent me this puppy. And he said, well, ma'am, you'll have to read the envelope. Merry Christmas. She opened the letter, and it was from her husband. He had written it 3 weeks before he died. In it was the words of encouragement, asking her to remain strong, and he vowed that he was waiting for the day when she would join him, but that he wanted to give her this young animal to keep her company until she came to join him in heaven. Stella couldn't help but cry. She wiped the tears away. She put the letter down, and then remembering the puppy at her feet, she picked up the golden little furry ball, and she said, well, I guess it's you and me. And she says, come to think of it, she said, as she looked out over the neighbors' houses and the lights that were all glistening on the outside of their houses, and there was a song over the radio that was playing, Joy to the World, the Lord is come. There was this incredible sense of hope and peace that suddenly washed over her lonely, broken spirit. She said, the little dog, little fella, it's you and me, and you know what? There's a box down in the basement. I'll bet you like it. It's got a little Christmas tree in it. It's got a few little ornaments that you're going to love. It's going to really impress you. And there's a manger scene down there too. I'll tell you the story. Let's go get it. And because God is with us, you can take hope that He sent a package to you. I don't know what's in it. You'll have to open it. But it's from Him for your moment and whatever you're going through in this Advent season in your life. And He's still at work. And He's not done yet. And He will complete with His character and His faithfulness the ultimate final healing that He has promised, where He will make all things right. And you and I will be satisfied.